It always begins the same way. Quiet footsteps in stone corridors, a flickering candle held against the cold draft, and a chamber door slowly creaking open. Beyond it sits a king, crowned but slouched, cloaked in fur yet chilled to the bone, staring into nothing as if haunted by every decision he ever made. And perhaps he was. Some say history is a tale of brave leaders and noble quests. But if you listen closely, beneath the pages and scrolls, you'll find stories that are slower, stranger, and far more unsettling. Tales of kings who ruled not with wisdom or mercy, but with fear, suspicion, or simply confusion. This is not the story of heroes. This is the quiet march of the terrible kings of medieval history. Rulers so unfit, so troubling in their decisions, that their names drift through time like cold winds through castle halls. Tonight, as you settle in under warm blankets, drifting off to the gentle hum of old stories, let's wander back to the crumbling courts, smoke-filled hearths, and long-forgotten kingdoms where these troubled rulers lived and ruled. The fire burns low in the corner. The servants have stopped whispering. And outside, the wind carries with it the sighs of an empire on the brink of something dark. Our first tale takes us to the early 1300s, deep in the heart of medieval Europe. Imagine a village not far from the king's castle, its streets muddy with melted snow, its windows shuttered against rumors from the capital. News travels slowly in these parts, and by the time it arrives, it's mostly worry and guesswork. But the whispers this week are different. There's talk of food being taken from markets, of local leaders replaced overnight, and of a king, young, impulsive, and dangerously unpredictable. King Aldrich II had inherited his crown far too soon. His father, a warrior king, had fallen in a skirmish near the northern woods, and by the time his body returned wrapped in royal cloth, Aldrich was being measured for his coronation robes. He was only 17. At that age, most boys in the kingdom were tending flocks or being trained with wooden swords. But Aldrich sat on a real throne, surrounded by royal advisors, making decisions that would shape lives, even as his own hands still trembled from fear. The court had expected his mother, Queen Isolde, to rule as regent. But Aldrich refused. He declared himself ready, insisted he would honor his father's memory by ruling with strength. What followed, though, was not strength. It was something else entirely. At first, Aldrich was obsessed with control. He sent men to count every sheep in the western meadows, ordered maps redrawn to show every stream and fence post, and banned music in the castle halls after dark. Then came the stranger laws. Anyone found wearing green could be fined, and bread could only be baked on odd-numbered days. People laughed at first quietly, but when the punishments began, they stopped laughing. One cold morning, a baker from a northern village was brought before the king. His crime? He'd baked rye bread on a Tuesday. The man bowed low, apologized, and offered to give the bread to the poor. Aldrich did not smile. He had the man placed in the stocks for 3 days, then banned rye bread from being sold within 10 miles of the castle. When the baker's family protested, they were sent to work clearing snow from the road to the mountain pass, a job usually given to prisoners. The people grew nervous. Ministers began resigning one by one. The castle grew quieter, not with peace, but with unease. Yet Aldrich remained certain he was right. A kingdom must be shaped like clay, he told his new advisor, a silent man named Corlin who rarely blinked. Firm hands make a strong mold. But not all kings were young. Some were simply tired. Half a continent away, in the lowlands of the Eastern Isles, King Berenger the Grey sat atop a throne older than he was. His beard reached his belt, and his hands shook so badly that he often dropped his goblet before it reached his lips. Berenger had ruled for nearly 4 decades, though no one could quite say how. He hadn't been seen outside the castle in years, and it was rumored he slept through most meetings. Yet still, the proclamations came. More taxes, fewer festivals, curfews that changed weekly. It was said Berenger only trusted his cat, a fat orange creature named Embertuft, who once had an entire room to himself and a servant who brushed his fur each morning. When Berenger's eldest son, Prince Malwyn, offered to help him govern, the The king accused him of treason and had him sent to the Abbey of Stillness, a place where monks took vows of silence, and the wind never stopped howling through the trees. People in the villages spoke Berenger's name in whispers, not out of fear, but out of frustration. They didn't hate him. They were just tired. Tired of strange decisions, tired of the silence, and tired of watching their kingdom crumble beneath the weight of a king who ruled more like a ghost than a man. But among the many kings, perhaps none were more feared than King Torsin of the Iron Valley. Torsin was known as the Wolf King, not because he was strong or swift, but because of the way he stared. His eyes never blinked when he spoke, and even grown men found themselves turning away under his gaze. He spoke slowly, his voice gravelly and low, as though he were chewing the words as he said them. It's said he never raised his voice, yet people ran when he entered a room. Torsin came to power not by birth, but by blood. He had been the general of the Old King's army and seized power after a midnight coup. The Old King vanished, and Torsin declared a new order. Gone were the festivals, the trade fairs, and the wandering storytellers. In their place were patrols, curfews, and shadowy messengers who rode in silence and never removed their helmets. But the strangest part? Torsin hated gold. He believed gold weakened a kingdom, made men soft and greedy. So he replaced all royal currency with heavy iron tokens marked with his seal, a snarling wolf with hollow eyes. Merchants protested, but were soon silenced. Some disappeared, others fled. The kingdom became quiet, but not calm. No music played in inns. No children laughed in the streets. Even the dogs barked less. One winter, a village in the hills tried to rebel by keeping the old gold coins in secret. Word reached Torsin in just 3 days. He sent riders not to arrest them, but to take their bells. All the village's bells, from churches to schoolhouses to goat collars, were seized and melted down. "You may have your gold," Torsin said in a message carved on wood, "but you shall have no joy." As the fire crackles softly and the night stretches deeper, it becomes clear that not all kings wore crowns of wisdom. Some wore crowns of iron, of silence, or of confusion. And in the long halls of history, their footsteps echo still, not as triumphs, but as warnings. But what happened when these kings crossed paths? When ambition met madness, when control met silence, and when the kingdoms themselves began to push back. Somewhere in the middle of these tales lies a hidden story of a letter that vanished, a meeting that was never supposed to happen, and a betrayal that rewrote everything. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another hour. The story of terrible kings isn't just about their strange rules or silent halls. It's about the people who had to live beneath their crowns. The blacksmiths, the bakers, the shepherds who had no choice but to bow when a bad decision changed their lives overnight. And often, it wasn't just the laws that hurt. It was the fear. Fear of being watched. Fear of not knowing what new rule would fall from the throne by sunrise. Fear of silence. Or worse, of being called upon and not knowing the right answer. In the southern marshlands of Arvenmere, King Hauric the Unsteady had ruled for nearly 11 years. His castle sat in the center of a wide, flooded valley where frogs croaked louder than trumpets and moss crept along every stone wall. Hauric rarely left his chambers. He didn't like noise, or change, or people, really. He spent his days with scrolls, endless scrolls, rewriting tax laws no one understood, adjusting road boundaries by inches, and composing letters to kings who'd long since died. What made Hauric truly terrible wasn't violence or greed. It was confusion. Deep, stubborn confusion. He once ordered an entire village relocated after mistaking it for a hunting preserve he believed had existed 100 years earlier. Another time, he banned the color blue after misreading a merchant report that mentioned a blue sickness in a neighboring land. No one dared explain the illness was metaphorical, describing melancholy, not an actual disease. So people hid their rugs, dyed their tunics brown, and painted over shutters. Even the sky seemed to dim when Hauric passed by. In his court, ministers spoke in careful riddles, hoping he wouldn't notice if something contradicted his beliefs. The problem was, Howrick forgot things just as quickly as he enforced them. He'd demand a law be reversed, and then deny he'd ever written the original. Eventually, his advisors stopped writing anything down. Instead, they nodded, bowed, and quietly ignored most of his commands, unless they came twice. Then they listened. Usually, people didn't hate Howrick, though. Not the way they feared King Torsin or distrusted Aldrich. They pitied him. There was something deeply lonely about Howrick, something that made even the palace guards speak softly around him. His wife had passed during childbirth years ago, and his son had been sent to foster care with a cousin far away. Rumor had it that Howrick barely remembered their names. One winter night, when the marshes froze and the frogs fell silent, Howrick was seen standing alone on the battlements, staring into the cold fog, mumbling names no one recognized. He stayed there until dawn, his robe flapping in the wind like a forgotten banner. But while some kings faded quietly, others roared into the history books with fire and fear. Far to the west, past dry plains and stone cities, there once ruled a man known only as the Dust King. His real name had long since been lost, burned from records, whispered only in hush. He came from the desert lands and ruled without castle or crown. Instead, he rode from town to town on a gray mare, followed by a caravan of enforcers dressed in bone-colored robes, faces veiled in sackcloth. He didn't believe in walls, or laws, or letters. A king should be seen, he once said, not signed. So he showed up, at bakeries, at town squares, at weddings. His presence alone was enough to change a festival into a funeral. People didn't dance when he passed. They didn't speak. They simply stepped back and waited until the sound of hooves faded into the dust. He hated reading, too, thought it softened the mind. So he banned books, scrolls, even letters. Entire libraries were emptied and turned into sleeping chambers for his writers. Monks were made to recite prayers from memory or be sent into exile. Towns that resisted woke one morning to find their wells filled with sand. But perhaps the strangest thing about the Dust King was what he carried. Not a sword, but a chain. A long, rusted iron chain wrapped around his waist like a belt. No one knew what it symbolized, and no one dared ask. Some thought it was from the prison where he'd once been held. Others believed it came from a shipwreck he survived as a boy. A few whispered that he simply liked the sound it made. Clink, 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 as he walked the streets at dawn. His rule didn't last long. Most didn't, but the fear lingered for decades. Children would play hide from the Dust King, hiding behind trees when the wind blew. And old women, even years later, would pause when a horse approached in the distance, holding their breath until the rider passed. But in the soft corners of the world, there were other kings. Smaller, less known, but no less terrible in their own quiet ways. Take, for example, King Durand of the Isle of Thorns. A pale man with a thin voice and a strange habit of keeping every mirror in the palace covered by cloth. He believed mirrors could steal part of your soul if you looked too long. No one was sure where the belief came from, perhaps a tale from his grandmother or a fever dream. But it shaped his entire reign. Durand refused to meet with foreign envoys unless they wore blindfolds. His court was lit only by candlelight, and any glass surface, even goblets, was banned. His paranoia grew over time. Soon, he believed reflections were spying on him. He destroyed fountains, smashed polished shields, and even banned the sea from being mentioned in court for fear of its mirrored surface. His subjects lived in a strange twilight. No reflections, no clear water, no light brighter than a flame. He once executed a servant for polishing the floor too well. Durand claimed he saw his own shadow and thought it was a spirit sent to kill him. By the end of his reign, the palace was a maze of shadows and flickering lights. He rarely emerged from his chambers, speaking through a curtain and eating only food delivered in unmarked bowls. When he died, the people didn't know whether to weep or laugh. In the end, they simply uncovered the mirrors, lit the halls, and opened the palace windows to let in the sun again. These were kings who shaped history not with greatness, but with fear, confusion, silence, and superstition. And though their crowns have long since crumbled and their castles turned to moss and ruin, their stories remain. not as legends of glory, but as quiet warnings. Yet, among these tales, one name keeps appearing, sometimes in old scrolls, sometimes in songs that shouldn't exist, and sometimes whispered by those who study forgotten history. A name so buried, so carefully erased, that even now, it refuses to stay gone. A name tied to all these kings, each one touched, advised, or changed by a single figure who never ruled but always watched. A man whose face appears in paintings from different eras, always in the background. A man with no title, no home, and no recorded death. They called him the Pale Advisor, and he, it seems, may have been the thread tying all these terrible kings together. But who was he, and why did so many rulers listen to him? The answers may lie deeper in the shadows of these stories, just beyond the next candle. There are no records of the Pale Advisor's birth. No scroll in any royal library mentioned a mother or a father. He seemed to simply appear, always at the edge of things, in portraits and letters, in footnotes and forgotten fragments. One scribe in the kingdom of Florence described him as a man of quiet boots and steady gaze, and another, nearly a century later, noted that he did not age as others did, nor hunger, nor sleep. Not as we understand it. But perhaps that's only legend. In truth, no one truly knew who he was. Only that he was there, always close to kings who would go on to rule poorly, always present in times of confusion or cruelty. Some claimed he was a healer, others a scholar. Still others thought him a mere servant, overlooked and underestimated. But wherever he went, strange things followed. He first appears, faintly, in the court of young Aldrich II, the impulsive boy king who banned music and bread on Tuesdays. An advisor named Ser Elian was said to have arrived from the far north, offering counsel after Aldrich's first winter left half the kingdom hungry. He wore gray robes, carried no personal seal, and spoke in riddles. The silence of the wind is the sound of wisdom, he told the king once, as farmers begged for food. Aldrich took that to mean he should ignore the petitions. The food stayed locked in storehouses, and many villages saw no grain until spring. Elian was gone before the next snowfall. No record of him leaving the palace, no farewell. Just vanished. But a decade later, in another kingdom far to the east, a new advisor appears in court, pale, gray-robed, and bearing a scroll written in a language no one could read. He helped the old king Berenger the Grey enforce new taxes and sealed letters with a twisted ribbon of silver instead of wax. People called him the White Whisper. In time, his name changed, his titles changed, and yet his appearance and effect remained the same. Calm words, quiet steps, and strange ideas planted like seeds that grew into odd laws and empty fields. But perhaps the most troubling story comes from the Isle of Rinholm, where King Vale the Solemn ruled over cliffs, fog, and fishers who lived in stone huts close to the water's edge. Vale was not born terrible. He had been loved once, by his people, his court, even the poets, who praised his gentleness and his soft hand with justice. He was called the King Who Listened, and for the first 10 years of his reign, the island prospered. Then one year, a quiet man arrived on a boat without flag or name. He wore a thin silver ring and spoke softly. The king welcomed him, as he welcomed all strangers, and gave him a place in court. The man introduced himself only as Thale. No one remembered where he sat during meetings, but somehow he was always there. And soon after, the king's demeanor began to change. He stopped walking the village roads. He stopped asking questions. He stopped laughing. Thale whispered warnings into the king's ear, of betrayal among the ministers, of hidden threats in the fishing guilds, of plots that never came. The king began to trust only Thale. He withdrew from his council. He ordered construction of a high wall around the palace, then filled the moat with broken glass. The fishermen were taxed for every net they cast. The healers were ordered to report every conversation they had. Within 2 years, the island had changed completely. The poets called it the Long Fog. And when the king passed, alone, with no heir and no mourners, Thale was nowhere to be found. It was always like that. He arrived in silence, and he left in silence. But the kingdoms never recovered. And what remained behind was always the same: ruin, unrest, and a question that no historian has ever answered. Was he simply an opportunist, a man drawn to power and weak kings? Or was he something else? One old legend, barely legible on a crumbling scroll from a mountain abbey, tells of a traveler with eyes the color of faded ink who came to the first human king and offered him a secret. In exchange, the king gave up the right to die in peace. Since then, the scroll claims the traveler has walked the world, always advising but never ruling, always pushing but never lifting. A shadow with a voice. Of course, that's just a story, or so is thought, until one spring, many years after King Torsen's death, when a merchant family cleaning out the cellar of their ancestral home found something strange. Behind a crumbling wall, they uncovered a sealed box wrapped in wax cloth and iron twine. Inside, there was a bundle of letters, at least 24, each written in a different hand from different kings. The letters were addressed to the Pale One. They weren't instructions. They were confessions. One letter read, "I did as you said. The grain was burned. They cried, but I trusted your plan." Another, "I fear I have gone too far, but you promised me they would understand. They never did." And one more, nearly illegible with age, "I no longer know which thoughts are mine. I write this so that if I am gone, someone will know I tried." Each letter ended with the same mark, a simple line, crossed by another, like a narrow window with no glass. Historians dismissed the letters as forgeries at first. No names were clear, and the paper looked too fresh. But one scholar noticed something odd. The wax seal used on the letters, the twisted silver ribbon, matched one found on an unmarked document from King Berenger's reign. And soon, more pieces began to surface. A faded portrait in a chapel showed a man with no title, standing at the shoulder of a young king whose name had been forgotten. The man's eyes had no pupils. Another kingdom found a ledger of royal expenses that included, once a year, a single payment marked only for the ghost. And then there was the shepherd's tale from the Frostwood Hills. An old man, nearly blind, once told a visiting scribe that as a boy, he'd wandered too far from home and gotten lost. Night fell, and he curled up beneath a tree to wait for dawn. Just before sleep took him, he saw a figure standing in the mist. Not threatening, not cruel, just still. The figure sat by him until morning, never speaking. When the boy awoke, the man was gone. But carved into the bark of the tree was a mark, a line crossed by another. Years later, the boy, then a grown man, served as a stable hand for the local governor. One evening, a pale advisor visited the manor. The man smiled politely. He moved slowly, and when he walked past, the stable hand felt cold. Not the chill of weather, the chill of recognition. All of this may be coincidence, or it may not be. The pale advisor was never crowned, never worshipped, never even chased. But the worst kings in history all carried the mark of his presence, on their scrolls, in their memories, and in the strange silence that followed them. And now, as our fire burns low and the wind presses gently against the windows, we're left with one final thought to rest on before drifting further into sleep. What if the worst rulers weren't just born foolish, or cruel, or confused? What if they were guided? And if so, where is he now? Somewhere beyond the mountains of Greyfen, across a sea that no longer appears on maps, there once stood a kingdom called Lyrenthal. Today, it's just a legend told around hearths and fading inns, but there are fragments, tiny hints, in monastery records and broken stone carvings. Lyrenthal was said to be surrounded by fog all year round. No sun ever fully pierced it. No bird ever flew far overhead. And at the heart of that gray kingdom sat a king known only as the Crownless One. He wore no crown, not because he refused it, but because it was taken from him. On the day of his coronation, the story goes, the sky turned dark before the ceremony began. A storm rolled in from the sea, bringing waves so high they crashed against the outer palace walls. The wind howled through the halls, snuffing out every candle. And then came the man, the pale advisor. He appeared at the king's side that very night, soaked from the rain, yet dry beneath his cloak. He whispered something to the Crownless One, no one knows what, and by morning, the crown had vanished from the ceremonial platform. A new law was announced that day. There would be no more crowns in Lyrenthal. Kings should be obeyed, not adorned, said the proclamation. From that moment, the new ruler sat on a plain wooden chair, wore no robe, and banned all signs of royal status. The people were confused. Some thought humble, others suspected madness. But over the years, the rules became stranger. The king allowed no music in public. Anyone who laughed too loudly was fined. Names of past rulers were erased from walls and monuments. Entire families who bore noble surnames were forced to change them to commoner or son of none. History, slowly, was peeled away, and always behind the throne, if you could call it that, stood the advisor. Never speaking during court, never writing anything, just watching. His eyes, they said, were hard to meet, like staring at a candle too long. Eventually, people stopped resisting. They didn't understand what was happening, but they understood it was safer not to ask. Lyrenthal grew quiet. Streets emptied. Shops closed early. Travelers began avoiding the kingdom altogether, choosing to ride the longer coastal paths rather than pass through its lands. Over time, maps stopped marking it at all, and Lyrenthal faded from memory like breath on glass. The only known account of what might have happened afterward comes from a single letter written by a monk who traveled there decades later. He wrote, "I walked for 2 days in silence through their streets. I saw no people, no animals, only the sound of wind and a presence, something watching but never seen. I left before sunset. I do not believe anyone remains, but I do not believe it is truly empty either. What happened to the crownless one is unknown." As with so many kings who came into contact with the Pale Advisor, the end is always a blur. Not a dramatic fall, just a slow unraveling, as if their stories weren't erased, but softly folded away and left behind. But not every king met the Pale Advisor directly. Some were touched by his ideas, by those who once knew him, or by whispers passed down in court from one mind to another like a candle's flame shared from wick to wick. King Roderick of Ferndale was one such man. Roderick was once a promising ruler, a skilled writer, a thoughtful speaker, and a beloved figure to his people. His realm was modest but fertile, and for years he governed with care. He held weekly open courts where even the poorest farmer could speak. He forgave debts during poor harvests and refused to raise taxes unless absolutely necessary. People called him Roderick the Fair. But when his sister died suddenly in childbirth, something in him shifted. He became quiet, withdrawn. And then, a new counselor appeared at court. Not the Pale Advisor himself, but a woman who claimed to be from a far-off land, bearing lessons passed down from an old teacher who had once advised kings in the East. Her name was Serwyn, and she had long gray hair tied with iron pins. She did not speak often, but when she did, Roderick listened. Soon, the old court meetings ended. The council was replaced with written messages. Roderick stopped walking the streets. He began reshaping the laws in small ways, first requiring daily silence in marketplaces, then forbidding gatherings after dusk. He banned the ringing of bells, said they caused confusion, and even outlawed public laughter in churches. When questioned, he gave no explanation beyond, "The old ways have ended." No one ever saw Serwyn leave the castle. One day, she was simply gone, but her teachings remained. The realm grew still, the people uneasy, and though Roderick never became cruel, something in him grew cold, a sadness that spread across the land like frost. When he died, it was in his garden, surrounded by silent courtiers. The funeral procession passed through empty streets. No songs were sung, no eulogy was read. It was said his tomb bore only one mark, a window crossed with a line. Even now, in forgotten corners of castles and abbeys, that mark has been found etched quietly into stone, a simple line crossed by another, too plain to draw attention, too strange to ignore, always near rooms where bad decisions were made, near scrolls with faded ink and missing names. Some historians say it's nothing, just coincidence, or perhaps a symbol used by an old monk's order. But those who spent their lives studying lost kings and their terrible legacies know better. They speak of a pattern, one that stretches through time like a barely visible thread. And that thread always leads back to the same pale figure. A man who never claimed a throne, yet shaped the worst among them. A man who was not feared in battle, nor praised in song, but who, somehow, left more ruins behind than armies ever could. So who was he? Was he real? Or was he an idea, passed from one frightened ruler to another in their weakest moments, offering comfort cloaked in stillness, order wrapped in ruin? And if he was real, where did he go? Some say he vanished after the fall of Lyrenthal, that his work was done and the world had changed enough that he was no longer needed. Others believe he is still out there, advising in whispers, in letters unsigned, in strange dreams that come to those burdened with power. There's even an old fable from the coastal town of Braywick that tells of a sailor who met a silent man on an island no one could find again. The man wore gray, never blinked, and asked only one question. If you could rule without love, but with perfect order, would you? The sailor said no. The man smiled, and the island disappeared behind a wall of fog. Tonight, as sleep gently pulls at the edges of thought and the fire turns to embers, you might wonder what makes a terrible king. Is it cruelty, foolishness, or simply the wrong voice at the wrong time? And if you listen closely, past the wind, past the stillness, past even the turning of history itself, you might hear the softest sound of all, a quiet voice offering advice. But what it says next, well, that is a tale waiting just beyond the next breath. There was once a small kingdom nestled between two rivers, known in older maps as Norvale. Few speak of it now. The land is quiet, overgrown with ivy and trees too thick to match the shape of remembered roads. But centuries ago, it thrived with orchards and gentle farms, a place where bells rang each morning to greet the sun and smoke curled softly from 1,000 chimneys. Norvale had no natural enemies, no great wealth to tempt invaders. For a time, it seemed like a place history might forget, not from neglect but from peace. Then came King Thandrick. He hadn't been born to rule. He was the third son, quiet and bookish, often left behind during hunts or feasts. He spoke gently, and when he did speak, people listened more out of politeness than interest. But fate has its turns, and when his two elder brothers died unexpectedly, one from illness, one from fall off a horse, Thandrick found himself wearing a crown he never wanted. At first, he governed carefully, relying heavily on his counsel and his childhood tutor, Master Wern, who had raised him like a second father. But something changed after a visit from a foreign envoy, an older man with pale skin and quiet eyes, who spoke to Thandrick privately for many hours in the candlelit study. No one knows what was said, but after that night, Master Wern was dismissed from court and quietly sent to a monastery across the river. Soon after, the changes began. The bells stopped ringing in the morning. Too distracting, the king said. Public dances were canceled. Town criers were instructed to deliver news in hushed voices. Citizens were ordered to paint over murals in bright colors and replace them with simple earth tones. Festivals were shortened. Later, they were banned altogether. People didn't understand. Thandrick had always been mild, a thoughtful young man who once wept during a village ceremony when a boy lost his dog. Now he walked the halls without expression, giving orders in tones flat as winter air. He no longer asked about the harvest or visited the markets. He met with no children, no elders. Only his new advisor, a man called Arden, who had no known homeland and left no trace in the castle records before arriving. At night, the servants whispered. They said the king no longer slept in his own bedchamber, that he had taken to walking the upper halls alone with Arden, speaking in a language no one recognized. Some claimed they saw strange books delivered under guard, with covers bound in iron clasps and pages that shimmered oddly in the candlelight. Others swore they heard music, soft, eerie, coming from the highest tower after midnight, even though no musicians had been allowed in court for over a year. Still, Thandrick insisted everything was fine. He sent out scrolls announcing a new age of order and clarity. The chaos of celebration, he wrote, has distracted us from duty. The joy of the crowd has weakened the voice of the crown. No one could remember him ever speaking like that before. The people grew quiet, and that silence spread. Travelers who passed through Norvale stopped visiting. Neighboring kingdoms grew cautious. And though there was no war, no rebellion, no collapse, Norvale began to disappear. Not just from maps, but from memory. Years later, a scholar passing through the region asked an old woman by a well if she remembered the name of the king who once ruled there. She frowned, shook her head, and said, "There was a king? I remember the fog. That's all." This quiet decay, this slow unraveling, was always the way with kings touched by strange voices. Even those far from the old courts felt the echoes. In the highlands of Tyrants, King Edrin the Younger had barely reached his 20th year when he began to build what he called his Chamber of Reflection. It was a round stone room with no windows and no doors, only a narrow passage and a single chair carved from ash wood. Edrin spent hours inside it, every day, sometimes whole nights. He spoke little of what he heard there, only saying that the room taught him things. After his visits, his rules became unpredictable. He ordered every road leading to the capital narrowed to half its width. "Too much movement is dangerous," he explained. He banned mirrors and polished metal, not for fear of vanity, but because he claimed he once saw his second self blink at him in the reflection. His guards carried no blades, only wooden staffs, and he required all visitors to the palace to walk backward when entering. His people were baffled and frightened, but not of the king, of the idea that he was seeing something they couldn't, that there was another logic, one too far from the ordinary world for them to understand. When asked what he saw in the chamber, Edrin simply said, "Patterns, and someone showing me the space between them." The king died before reaching 30. The Chamber of Reflection was sealed shut with stone and ash. To this day, no one has broken it open. Travelers claim to hear faint whispers near the hill where it stands, but only on windless days, when even the trees hold still. All across the old kingdoms, stories like these lie buried in faded ink and broken statues. Sometimes they're dismissed as superstition, just coincidence, a bad harvest, a troubled mind. But over and over, the pattern returns. A king, once kind or curious, changes. A new advisor, never clearly named, arrives. Silence spreads, rules tighten, joy leaves, and always, somewhere nearby, a pale figure whose name never truly stays the same. Some say he's not a man at all, that he's a memory passed between crowns. Then the moment a ruler first feels doubt, that quiet moment alone in a tower or at a desk, he appears, not to force ruin, but to offer something tempting, the promise of perfect order, of clean lines and quiet days. A kingdom without noise, without surprise, without pain. And perhaps that's the most dangerous offer of all, because terrible kings aren't always born cruel. Some simply choose the silence. And once they do, the voice that guided them slips into shadow, waiting for the next crown to weigh heavy. There was a time before the printing press and parchment wide enough to hold all the stories of the world, when memories lived in people's mouths. A grandmother's tale, a merchant's warning, a child's lullaby. These held more truth than anything ink could carry. And in those murmured histories passed down by firelight, certain names faded while others clung like burrs to wool. The Pale Advisor was one of those names. Even in the furthest villages, untouched by royal law and nestled beside crooked rivers, someone always remembered a version of him. Never the same face, never the same name, but always the same feeling. "I saw him once," said an old miller in Dunreach, her hands scarred by time and flour. "He came with a trader caravan, didn't speak, didn't eat, just watched the fire all night. I woke to find he'd left me a coin with no king's face, just a window carved on both sides. And ever since, well, I can't sleep through the night without feeling I'm being counted." Another story came from a stable boy in Bryn Mawr who claimed that his master's dog barked at an empty chair for 7 nights straight after a strange man passed through. No one believed him, of course. But years later, after that same noble banned music from his estate and dismissed all his servants in favor of silence, the the boy remembered. It wasn't always the kings who fell under the advisor's shadow. Sometimes it was those who served them. A knight named Ser Harwin once rode with King Torwin the Flame, a ruler known for his loud voice and louder armor, always polished, always gleaming. Torwin believed in spectacle. He wanted to be remembered. Every judgment he gave was accompanied by trumpet blasts. Every royal feast ended with a fireworks display over the river. He hosted weekly duels, not for war but for applause. The people didn't fear him. They rolled their eyes. But everything changed the day a cloaked man arrived at the tournament fields. He didn't speak, didn't compete. He simply stood in the shade of a cypress tree and watched Torwin with such stillness that even the birds avoided the branches above him. By dusk, he was gone. But Torwin changed after that. He canceled the duels, took down the colored banners. He began wearing black. He ordered his family's coat of arms, once a lion mid-roar, redrawn into a plain square. A kingdom is not a theater, he said. It is a room, quiet, clean, controlled. Ser Harwin was the only knight who dared question him. You used to laugh, Harwin said one evening, when the two shared wine in the now empty grand hall. You used to smile. I used to mistake noise for strength, Torwin replied. Now I know better. But Harwin never truly accepted it. One night, restless and curious, he searched the old scroll rooms of the keep. Hidden beneath a loose stone, he found a page half-burned at the edges. It bore a drawing, not of a crown or a weapon, but of a square window crossed with a line. Beneath it, in trembling ink, someone had written, "He is not what he says." Harwin never saw Torwin again. It said he left the kingdom that very night, riding west until the coast swallowed him. The ship he boarded was never named, and no one ever saw it dock again. There are those who try to explain it all away. They say it's coincidence, the way some kings fall ill, or grow old, or grow tired. That the idea of an outsider shaping ruin is just a story people tell, because it's easier than believing power itself can undo a person. That maybe these kings were already broken, and the advisor, if he existed, was only ever a shadow cast by their own fear. But others disagree. One historian, Eldrick Marn, a quiet scholar from the North Marches, spent 40 years tracing the advisor's trail through fragments and field notes, old castle diaries, and tales traded between wine cellars and orphan scribes. He never made any public claim, never wrote a book, but in the final years of his life, he kept a journal. The pages were mostly dates and places, but one entry stands out. They all describe the same feeling, he wrote. Not terror, not hatred, just quiet. A sudden hush that follows wherever he goes. And when he leaves, they are never the same. Marn disappeared not long after. His cottage was found empty. The fireplace was still warm. The only thing left behind was a stack of journals and a window etched with a single mark. A line, crossed by another. You might wonder why this matters now. Why a tale of kings long gone and a man who may never have lived still hangs in the air like distant thunder. But the truth is, stories like these are never really gone. Somewhere right now, there is a leader, quiet, uncertain, standing at the edge of a decision they do not yet understand. Maybe they rule over a nation, maybe only a house, but the weight is real. And in that quiet, the voice may return. Not loudly, not in dreams or letters. Just a whisper, a suggestion, a way to make the silence stretch longer. Because the most terrible rulers are rarely born cruel. They are born human, and somewhere along the way, they stop listening to others and begin listening only to one voice. A voice that offers comfort through control, order without kindness, peace without joy. And for those who accept it, the world grows still. So still, they forget what it was like to feel anything at all. Tonight, as the fire burns low and your eyes grow heavy, you may find yourself wondering, just softly, like a passing thought, who the pale advisor truly was. A ghost? A man? A myth? Or maybe just a part of power that fears losing itself. But the answer, like so many in these tales, is not ready to be found. Not yet, because there are still kings to remember, still broken courts and silent halls, still stories left buried beneath stone and snow. and before we rest, we must walk through one more shadowed door. In the forested hills of Arlo Fon, long after kingdoms had risen and fallen elsewhere, there once lived a king who never left his tower. His name was Aemon the Quiet, though that was not the name he was born with. In the earliest years of his rule, he was called Aemon the Open-Handed, for he forgave debts, freed the imprisoned, and gave away more gold than his treasurer thought wise. His voice was kind and steady, and he loved to walk among his people without guards or fanfare, just a plain cloak and muddy boots. They say he laughed easily, even at the smallest things: a goose escaping a market stall, a child offering him a wildflower, a baker's pie that collapsed in the oven. He ruled not with strength, but with warmth. His people trusted him, not out of fear, but affection. Then, one winter, a traveler arrived at the edge of the kingdom. No name, no papers. He wore a long gray coat and had a slight limp that made him lean heavier on his left side. He asked no favors, accepted no meals, and made no trouble. He stayed one night in the village at the foot of the King's Hill, then continued on up the winding road toward the old stone tower where Aemon lived. From that day forward, the king changed. Not suddenly. Slowly, like a lamp running out of oil. He stopped walking the village roads, stopped smiling. Then, he stopped speaking altogether. He would nod or gesture, but words became a rare thing. He canceled public meetings, declined invitations, dismissed his musicians, his cooks, and even his cousins who had helped him govern. At first, people waited, patient and hopeful. A season of silence, they called it. Perhaps the king grieved something we do not know. But the season stretched on. Years passed. Aemon's face was seen only in passing, a shape behind a curtain, a shadow on the tower's balcony. The tower windows remained shut, even in spring. A low humming sound, faint and rhythmic, was sometimes heard at night, like wind moving through a hollow pipe, but steadier. No one dared knock, and as time wore on, Arlofen began to feel less like a kingdom and more like a dream someone once had and then forgot upon waking. There were no laws passed, no wars fought, no decrees issued, just a long, steady quiet that settled over everything like moss. The markets grew still, the schools stopped teaching, the festivals ended, the riverboats no longer brought travelers. Roads became soft with grass. The only proof that Aemon still lived was the single lantern that remained lit in the highest window of the tower, glowing every night without fail. The villagers whispered that he wasn't alone up there, that the man who arrived that winter never left, that he had taken over the king's thoughts, filled the silence with strange logic. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he was an old god, forgotten by name but not by purpose. And a few, softly, with unease in their eyes, called him an advisor. Eventually, the name Aemon vanished from common speech. People called the hill the Silent Rise. The tower they called the Whisper's Perch. And the kingdom itself had no name anymore. It was just the place beyond the trees where no birds sang. These stories, scattered like broken stones across time, may seem unconnected. A king here, a kingdom there, a single figure drifting between them. But there's something deeper beneath them all, a kind of current, faint but steady. It's the feeling of something watching not from above, but from beside. Something that doesn't strike but waits, not to destroy, but to advise, to guide gently into the soft shadows of stillness. Because not every terrible king was cruel with intention. Some just listened to the wrong voice at the wrong moment. And in the quiet halls of power, where decisions echo louder than footsteps, that voice always seems to find its way in. There's a record, barely legible, found in a church ledger far to the north, dated in a century nearly forgotten. It reads, "His counsel was not forced upon me. It was offered like water. I drank. The thirst did not end." It's unsigned. The ink faded so badly that only a few words remain around the edges. But that one sentence, in the middle, survives, clear as if it were written yesterday. Some believe the pale advisor isn't just a man, that he's a reflection of fear itself. Not the loud kind of fear, screams or swords or storms, but the quiet kind. The fear of making the wrong choice. The fear of losing control. The fear of uncertainty that turns even good rulers inward. And once that inward turn begins, the doors close. The windows shut. The candles are snuffed out one by one, until the king, the ruler, the voice of a people, is alone, listening to someone who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He doesn't offer madness. He offers peace, but a peace that comes at the cost of color, sound, motion, connection. A peace that feels like the moment just before sleep, but never lets you wake. There are even tales, though few dare tell them aloud, of kings who tried to resist him, who sent something wrong early enough to fight back. One such tale comes from the deep West Coast, where Queen Mara of Kelwyn ruled a seafront city of artists and builders. She was clever, sharp-witted, unafraid of challenge. She welcomed debate, loved music, and laughed with her guards as if they were family. But she too received a visitor, this time in the form of a mute envoy, robed in gray, who carried a gift, a book with blank pages. Mara accepted it out of politeness, unsure of its purpose. That night, she opened it and saw the pages had filled themselves. They contained no threats, no secrets, only advice, soft suggestions, little things. Silence the bells during study hours. Reduce feast days, they distract from wisdom. Order the musicians to play softer. Speak less, listen more. Close the city gates 1 hour earlier. Day by day, the suggestions came. She resisted for a while, then began to try just one, then another. But one evening, Mara burned the book. She ordered her scribes to make music in the streets, ordered a public painting festival, ordered bells rung every morning and night. That night, the tower she slept in caught fire. No other structure in the city was harmed. The cause was never found. Mara survived, but she was never seen in public again. Her letters, once warm and lively, became brief and cold. And within a year, the music stopped. The city gates closed early again, and the sky over Kelwyn seemed just a little more gray. Some say the advisor does not like to be denied, but others believe that Mara's defiance carved a crack in the silence, that not all rulers gave in completely, that somewhere, among the ash and stone and stillness, there are memories waiting to be uncovered, proof that not all terrible kings were hopeless, that some tried to hold on to joy even as the quiet pressed in. But for now, those truths remain buried, just like the faces in old paintings, just like the names worn down on stone, just like the voice itself, waiting, as it always does, for someone to listen. Somewhere in the quiet edges of the known world, there's an abbey that no map names. It sits near the curve of an old mountain range where the trees are bent by constant wind, and the stars look closer than they should. The monks there have no leader. They live without titles. They speak only when needed and write everything by hand using ink made from ground ash. Their scrolls are not shared, not sold, not even read by those who write them. Each monk copies fragments passed down from previous generations, snippets of stories, pieces of law, broken prayers. And in every fifth scroll, without fail, appears a mark, a line crossed by another. Once, a traveling archivist named Leor came upon the abbey while seeking rare documents about vanished kingdoms. He was kind, quiet, and deeply curious, driven by a desire not for fame, but for understanding. The monks welcomed him with tea and bread, but refused his request to read their scrolls. Still, they allowed him to stay. Days passed, then weeks. Leor observed, helped in the gardens, watched the monks copy words they never spoke aloud. One night, during a thunderstorm, lightning struck a tree near the outer wall and split it in two. In the confusion, several scrolls were scattered. Leor found one beneath the chapel steps, open, wet with rain. The ink had not run. It told the story of a young ruler, unnamed, who received a visitor in a dream. The visitor offered no threat, only structure, a way to make sense of doubt. The ruler accepted, and soon as people forgot how to sing, Leor returned the scroll, but something lingered. A shape, a phrase, a silence in his chest that followed him even after he left the abbey. He wrote of the experience in his personal journal, but never published again. Instead, he moved to a small cottage and took up candle making. Those who knew him said he was kind, but often paused mid-sentence as if listening for something behind the wind. He was not the only one who noticed the strange pattern. Elsewhere, in distant archives and private collections, letters began to surface, some forged, some believed authentic. Royal scribes, dismissed without explanation. Musicians banned in cities where they once flourished. Entire languages erased from public life. And always near these odd silences was a figure, a name, a suggestion. The conflict was not just in the past. It was ongoing, slow, quiet, not a war of swords, but a battle of memory, a pulling away from joy, from openness, from chaos, towards something stiller, simpler, more controlled. And not everyone agreed it was wrong. A court philosopher named Clueless, who advised a small coastal prince, wrote an essay titled In Praise of the Pattern. In it, she argued that peace without celebration is still peace, that a quiet people are not necessarily a broken one, that perhaps the pale advisor was not a corrupter, but a necessary force, a cleaner of mess, a restorer of calm. She wrote, "The kings who followed him may have been feared, but they were never unprepared. In his wake, cities were still. Isn't that what rulers are meant to achieve? A place where nothing changes because nothing must." Others disagreed, loudly. A musician named Van Aldros, whose family had served in the courts of 4 different kingdoms, claimed her grandfather once wrote a melody based on a forgotten royal tune, one that had been outlawed long ago. When she played it in a quiet forest town, a man in a gray coat stopped her mid-song and whispered in her ear. She never spoke of what he said, but she never played again. The debate was not only about who the advisor was, but whether he should be remembered at all. Historians argued. Scribes took sides. A few highborn lords secretly funded searches for old scrolls, hoping to either erase or confirm the stories. But the truth was harder to find than any artifact, because the real conflict wasn't in books or letters. It lived in people, in rulers, in choices made behind closed doors, after the courtiers had gone home, after the advisors had bowed and left the room. In those moments when doubt slipped in, when the world felt too loud, too messy, too fragile, that's when the pale advisor truly spoke. And not all who heard him turned away. There was once a young empress, Erin of Telmere, who ruled during a time of confusion. The previous ruler had left the kingdom in debt. 2 factions quarreled in the courts. The people argued in the streets. No law pleased both sides. Erin was just 21, and already she felt the weight of 100 decisions she didn't know how to make. That's when she found the note. It had been slipped into a book on statecraft. She opened the page and found a square of folded parchment, soft with age. It contained a single line. "There is peace in narrowing the path." She dismissed it at first. A strange metaphor, nothing more. But the next morning, another note appeared, this time beneath her breakfast plate. "Let them shout, but give them no room to echo." She asked her guards. No one had entered. She scolded her staff. No one confessed. The notes kept coming. Not commands, just ideas. Little nudges. Hints of how to make order return. At first, she resisted. But the noise of the kingdom grew louder. Protests in the square. Debates in the court. Ministers resigning. Sleep became difficult. Food lost flavor. And so, one day, she followed one of the notes. A suggestion to restrict public gatherings to groups of 5 or fewer. Order returned. A little. Then another note. Permit only 3 official voices for the people. Order returned. A bit more. Soon, she found herself waiting for the notes each morning, even hoping for them, until one day they stopped. And in their absence, she panicked. She called for new advisors, but none knew what to say. She tried to restore old traditions, but they felt hollow. The silence left behind by the notes was worse than the chaos they once replaced. Her eyes became tired, her words dull. The people stopped fearing her. They stopped loving her, too. They just stopped, and the kingdom grew very quiet. The tension in these stories is never loud. It doesn't arrive with flames or trumpets. It settles in the corners. It grows in stillness. The conflict is slow, internal, and hard to name. Because how do you fight something that offers calm? How do you resist a whisper that tells you it's safer to let go? As our journey continues, you might find yourself wondering, as many have before, is silence safety? Is stillness strength? Or is it just another kind of forgetting? And if it is, who benefits from that forgetting? In a quiet town built on the edge of a dried-up river, there lived an old woman who refused to forget. Her name was Mita, and she had once worked in the kitchens of a palace that no longer stood. Time had taken the towers. Vines crept through broken stone. Wind moved through what had once been the Hall of Judgment, where kings declared their will. But Mita remembered every corner. The scent of time from the garden walls. The way sunlight hit the silver plates before dusk. The sound of horses shifting in the stables before morning court. And she remembered the king. His name was Eric. He wasn't cruel when he was young. He was nervous, overwhelmed. He had inherited a throne heavy with expectations and surrounded by people who smiled too much and said too little. Mita watched him grow up in that pressure, always watching others to see what they expected, trying to become what they needed. She remembered how he used to visit the kitchen quietly at night when sleep wouldn't come. He would sit on a wooden stool near the fire and talk to her, not as a king, but as a boy. He asked questions about her village, about bread, about dreams. And Mita, with her warm hands and kind eyes, answered him honestly. But then the silence began. A new man joined the court. Not a noble, not a knight, just a listener, they said. His name was never announced. His role never explained. But he was always there in the back of the hall, arms folded, watching. He didn't speak, not in public. He didn't need to. Eric stopped visiting the kitchen after that. He stopped laughing, stopped asking, stopped looking anyone in the eye unless he had to. Mita stayed quiet, but she knew the signs. She had seen people like that in her village when grief got too heavy, when someone spent too long in their own head. But this felt different. Not like sorrow, more like subtraction, as if pieces of Eric were being folded away, one at a time. Then came the changes. First, small. A new rule that visitors to the palace must wear gray. A new tax on dyes and bright fabrics. The removal of murals in the East Wing, because they were too distracting. The canceling of plays. The silencing of bells. All in the name of peace, of stillness, of control. Mita didn't ask questions. Most didn't. But she noticed how people lowered their voices when they spoke. How the gardens, once full of music and laughter, grew quiet. How even the birds seemed to avoid the high windows. And then one morning, the palace gates didn't open. No guards. No visitors. No explanation. Mita left before nightfall. She packed only bread and a single kettle and walked west, away from the stone walls that had once felt like a home. She never returned. But the dreams did. For years afterward, she would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. Not words she could understand, but the sound of someone speaking just outside the window, too low to hear clearly, too close to ignore. And always, in those dreams, the palace stood whole again. And Eric sat on his throne in silence, wearing no crown, while the man in gray stood behind him, watching. It wasn't just Mita. Stories like hers appeared across the old lands, in journals, songs, and carvings that barely survived. Each tale told in a different voice, but the message always the same. Someone comes. They speak little, if at all, and after they leave, or stay, the ruler is changed. Order spreads, but joy fades. Stillness replaces sound. Memory begins to slip. But some people remember. A child once scribbled drawings onto the stone floor of a forgotten chapel in the northern woods. Pictures of birds flying toward a castle, then turning back before reaching the tower. No one knows how the child got there. The drawings weren't found until decades later by a group of hikers who thought the building was just a ruin. One of them took a photo, and on one stone slab, carved deeper than the rest, was a symbol, a window, with a cross through it. No one could explain how a child would know that symbol. Just like no one could explain why songs that had been outlawed in one kingdom sometimes reappeared in others, slightly changed, slightly distorted, but carrying the same melody. Or why in distant villages, children sometimes whispered stories about a quiet king who didn't blink. Or why in certain paintings, if you looked long enough at the crowd, you might notice a single man in the background, watching, always just outside the main frame, always wearing gray. There were rumors of secret gatherings, small groups of historians, musicians, monks, and midwives, people who believed that memory must be protected, that the silence creeping through time was not just a curiosity, but a warning. These people called themselves the Unshuttered. They didn't fight with weapons. They didn't seek power. They just remembered. They passed down band songs, preserved old dialects, hid colorful tapestries in basements, lit candles on forgotten feast days. They wrote down names of rulers who had disappeared from official records and drew portraits of kings who had once been erased. And slowly, carefully, they began to notice patterns. The advisor never appeared in daylight. His presence was always felt in dusk, in candlelight, in long corridors. He never issued demands. He suggested. He never ruled. He advised. And when his voice was finally listened to, the first thing lost was always sound. A court poet once described it perfectly in a single line. He does not bring darkness. He only dims the lamp. But no one could agree on where he came from, or what he truly wanted. Some believed he was a memory of the first ruler who ever feared making a mistake. Others thought he was a guardian of order, misunderstood but necessary. A few, whispered in secret, wondered if he had no name at all, that he was simply what happens when a person chooses safety over connection, control over conversation. Even now, in quiet corners of forgotten lands, the tension lingers. Not in swords, not in armies, but in the choice between silence and speech, between comfort and risk, between being remembered for kindness or being forgotten in quiet rule. And somewhere, always somewhere, there is a ruler, young, tired, unsure, who stands before an empty hall, wondering which voice to trust. And in the farthest corner of that room, in the longest shadow of the last candle, someone stands still and waits. Somewhere in the quiet edges of the known world, there's an abbey that no map names. It sits near the curve of an old mountain range where the trees are bent by constant wind, and the stars look closer than they should. The monks there have no leader. They live without titles. They speak only when needed and write everything by hand using ink made from ground ash. Their scrolls are not shared, not sold, not even read by those who write them. Each monk copies fragments passed down from previous generations, snippets of stories, pieces of law, broken prayers. And in every fifth scroll, without fail, appears a mark, a line crossed by another. Once, a traveling archivist named Leor came upon the abbey while seeking rare documents about vanished kingdoms. He was kind, quiet, and deeply curious, driven by a desire not for fame, but for understanding. The monks welcomed him with tea and bread, but refused his request to read their scrolls. Still, they allowed him to stay. Days passed, then weeks. Leor observed, helped in the gardens, watched the monks copy words they never spoke aloud. One night, during a thunderstorm, lightning struck a tree near the outer wall and split it in two. In the confusion, several scrolls were scattered. Leor found one beneath the chapel steps, open, wet with rain. The ink had not run. It told the story of a young ruler, unnamed, who received a visitor in a dream. The visitor offered no threat, only structure, a way to make sense of doubt. The ruler accepted, and soon as people forgot how to sing, Leor returned the scroll, but something lingered. A shape, a phrase, a silence in his chest that followed him even after he left the abbey. He wrote of the experience in his personal journal, but never published again. Instead, he moved to a small cottage and took up candle making. Those who knew him said he was kind, but often paused mid-sentence as if listening for something behind the wind. He was not the only one who noticed the strange pattern. Elsewhere, in distant archives and private collections, letters began to surface, some forged, some believed authentic. Royal scribes, dismissed without explanation. Musicians banned in cities where they once flourished. Entire languages erased from public life. And always near these odd silences was a figure, a name, a suggestion, The conflict was not just in the past. It was ongoing, slow, quiet, not a war of swords, but a battle of memory, a pulling away from joy, from openness, from chaos, towards something stiller, simpler, more controlled. And not everyone agreed it was wrong. A court philosopher named Collis, who advised a small coastal prince, wrote an essay titled In Praise of the Pattern. In it, she argued that peace without celebration is still peace, that a quiet people are not necessarily a broken one, that perhaps the pale advisor was not a corrupter, but a necessary force, a cleaner of mess, a restorer of calm. She wrote, "The kings who followed him may have been feared, but they were never unprepared. In his wake, cities were still. Isn't that what rulers are meant to achieve? A place where nothing changes because nothing must." Others disagreed, loudly. A musician named Van Aldros, whose family had served in the courts of 4 different kingdoms, claimed her grandfather once wrote a melody based on a forgotten royal tune, one that had been outlawed long ago. When she played it in a quiet forest town, a man in a gray coat stopped her mid-song and whispered in her ear. She never spoke of what he said, but she never played again. The debate was not only about who the advisor was, but whether he should be remembered at all. Historians argued. Scribes took sides. A few highborn lords secretly funded searches for old scrolls, hoping to either erase or confirm the stories. But the truth was harder to find than any artifact, because the real conflict wasn't in books or letters. It lived in people, in rulers, in choices made behind closed doors, after the courtiers had gone home, after the advisors had bowed and left the room. In those moments, when doubt slipped in, when the world felt too loud, too messy, too fragile, that's when the pale advisor truly spoke. And not all who heard him turned away. There was once a young empress, Erin of Telmere, who ruled during a time of confusion. The previous ruler had left the kingdom in debt. 2 factions quarreled in the courts. The people argued in the streets. No law pleased both sides. Erin was just 21, and already she felt the weight of 100 decisions she didn't know how to make. That's when she found the note. It had been slipped into a book on statecraft. She opened the page and found a square of folded parchment, soft with age. It contained a single line. "There is peace in narrowing the path." She dismissed it at first. A strange metaphor, nothing more. But the next morning, another note appeared, this time beneath her breakfast plate. "Let them shout, but give them no room to echo." She asked her guards. No one had entered. She scolded her staff. No one confessed. The notes kept coming. Not commands, just ideas, little nudges, hints of how to make order return. At first, she resisted, but the noise of the kingdom grew louder. Protests in the square, debates in the court, ministers resigning. Sleep became difficult. Food lost flavor. And so, one day, she followed one of the notes. A suggestion to restrict public gatherings to groups of 5 or fewer. Order returned. A little. Then another note. Permit only 3 official voices for the people. Order returned. A bit more. Soon, she found herself waiting for the notes each morning, even hoping for them, until one day they stopped. And in their absence, she panicked. She called for new advisors, but none knew what to say. She tried to restore old traditions, but they felt hollow. The silence left behind by the notes was worse than the chaos they once replaced. Her eyes became tired, her words dull. The people stopped fearing her. They stopped loving her too. They just stopped. And the kingdom grew very quiet. The tension in these stories is never loud. It doesn't arrive with flames or trumpets. It settles in the corners. It grows in stillness. The conflict is slow, internal, and hard to name. Because how do you fight something that offers calm? How do you resist a whisper that tells you it's safer to let go? As our journey continues, you might find yourself wondering, as many have before, is silence safety? Is stillness strength? Or is it just another kind of forgetting? And if it is, who benefits from that forgetting? There was once a young scribe named Relon who worked beneath the marble arches of the royal archives in a small mountain kingdom called Eldwatch. The kingdom itself was not known for glory or war or wealth. It was known for its fog. For 6 months of every year, The valley would fill with a soft white mist that blurred the trees and made every lantern glow like a star. Relon was not important. He was not brave or clever or highborn. He simply copied. Every day, he sat with a quill and fresh parchment and copied old records into clean, ordered lines. Births, deaths, treaties, titles. It was a quiet job, and he liked it that way. One morning, Relon received a scroll that had no seal. It was faded and brittle, and it had been buried beneath a pile of shipping receipts from a century ago. The ink had almost disappeared, but the shape of the writing was strange, small, careful, slanted slightly left. As he copied it, he began to feel uneasy. Not because of what it said. Most of it was harmless. Observations, notes from court, a list of items removed from the treasury. But near the bottom of the scroll, in lighter ink than the rest, someone had written a phrase sideways along the margin. I have removed the windows from the king's study. He no longer wishes to look outside. It was unsigned. Relon read the line over and over, something about it resting uncomfortably in his chest. The next day, he returned to the archives and tried to find the original scroll again, but it was gone. Not misplaced, not lost, gone, as if it had never been there. He asked the head archivist, a quiet woman with silver hair, if she had seen it. She blinked slowly and said, "I'm sure you imagined it." But that night, Relon dreamt of a tall study room and a king sitting in darkness, staring at a wall where a window had once been. From that day on, Relon began to look for patterns in the margins of old scrolls, in forgotten diaries, in tax ledgers from towns that no longer appeared on maps. Over time, a picture began to form, not a clear one, but a shape, a story told in fragments, a presence that entered quietly and left even more quietly. In one record, a queen in the eastern dunes who banned the wearing of green. In another, a duke who forbade laughter during council meetings. In yet another, a prince who wrote, "I no longer need voices. I hear enough in silence." And again, in each, a mark, a cross, or a square, or a pair of intersecting lines. Always small, always hidden. Relon never spoke of his findings, but he began to walk the streets differently. He listened more carefully to what people weren't saying. He watched how quickly joy left a room. He noticed that some doors in the palace never opened anymore, that ministers were replaced without word, that the king's court, once full of voices, now echoed with a different kind of quiet. He did not know what to do, but he knew something was happening, and he was not alone. Far away, in a small academy built into the cliffs of the southern coast, a group of students had begun compiling what they called the Quiet Ledger. It was not officially sanctioned. It was passed from hand to hand, copied in secret, hidden beneath floorboards. It contained names, dates, symbols, and habits. It connected rulers who had never met. It outlined shifts in law, custom, and speech. And most of all, it kept track of silences. They marked every village where singing stopped, every library where colorful books disappeared, every ruler whose portrait was changed from smiling to stern. The ledger was never published, but it was known. Those who added to it did so in whispers. And each time it passed to new hands, it grew heavier, not with pages, but with weight. A quiet fear. A question. If this force, this advisor, had no army, no laws, and no true name, then how did he move through the world so easily? The answers were few, but they always returned to the same thing. Choice. The advisor never forced. He offered, and rulers, some frightened, some tired, some simply unsure, accepted. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until the walls closed in, the windows were sealed, the songs forgotten, and the people began to call it peace. But there were cracks, small ones. In an abandoned theater in the city of Renhall, someone had painted a mural on the inside of a broken ceiling, an image of a masked figure standing in front of a silent crowd. Above him, in letters nearly too faint to see, were the words, "If you must choose quiet, choose it freely. Do not let it choose you." In the ruins of a burned library, someone had scratched into stone, "The worst kings did not hate. They simply stopped hearing." And in a letter never sent, found beneath the floorboards of a forgotten cottage, a ruler had once written, "He gave me stillness. I gave him everything else." The conflict now was no longer just about kings. It was about memory, about the danger of forgetting joy, about the strange comfort of letting someone else decide what peace should look like. And that is what made it so hard to fight, because there was no enemy marching through gates. No battle horns, no fire, just a voice. Soft, steady, reassuring. And once heard, it was very hard to stop listening. Relon, back in the fogged hills of Eldwatch, sat one evening at his small desk, candle low, pen in hand. He had no clear plan, no army, no allies, only what he remembered, and what he refused to forget. He dipped the pen in ink and began to write, not in the royal script, but in his own. A story, not a scroll, not for kings, but for anyone who had ever felt the pull of silence. He wrote, "There are voices that sound like safety, but not all of them are meant to guide. Some are meant to keep you from remembering that joy, too, has a place in rule." And though no one read it that night, though no trumpets sounded, though no victory was won, something important happened. A record was made, not one ordered, not one copied, but one felt, one human voice, speaking softly against the quiet. And sometimes that's where resistance begins. Not with swords, but with stories. The fog in Eldwatch that year lingered longer than it ever had. By mid-spring, when the crocus should have begun to open and the lake should have reflected clear sky, everything was still pale and cold. Lanterns stayed lit well into midday. And in the high chamber of the scribe's hall, Relon worked later and later each evening, as if afraid that silence would catch up to him if he paused too long. He was not alone anymore. Word had begun to travel, quietly, in bundles of folded cloth, in the margins of shipping ledgers, in the stitching of a quilt sold by a passing trader. Symbols, names, warnings. A network of watchers and writers had grown from the scattered corners of ruined palaces and forgotten towns. They didn't call themselves rebels. They didn't even speak aloud. They just remembered, shared, recorded. And it was through one such record, a wax-sealed letter buried beneath barley sacks from the east, that Relon first read the words, "He walks again." The Pale Advisor. There had been rumors before. False sightings. Tall tales. A monk's dream. A lost child's murmur. But this letter was different. It named a place. Drevenhold. A kingdom nestled between sharp hills, once vibrant, now somber. A place whose leader, Queen Eileen, had once been a poet before she was crowned. Her words had filled taverns. Her verses were painted across bridges. But in the past year, not a single new line had appeared. Travelers said her palace was silent, that the gardens had been pulled out, that a thick curtain now hung in the throne room, that she rarely spoke, except in short commands. And always by her side, a man in gray. No one had heard him speak. No one knew his name. But those who saw him said he never blinked. And though no decree had been issued, the town square, once filled with music and food stalls, stood empty. A fountain once carved with dancing birds now trickled with cold water, and moss grew where laughter used to live. Relon packed only what he needed. He told no one where he was going, only left behind a single slip of parchment on his desk, marked with a small square window crossed through the middle. The journey was long. Through forest paths so narrow he had to lead his horse on foot. Through towns where people avoided eye contact. Through inns where no one asked questions. And always through quiet. It felt like something was closing in. Not quickly, not like a chase. More like a blanket being slowly drawn up over the face of the land. By the time Relon arrived at the edge of Drevenhold, he already knew the stories were true. The gates were open, but no guard stood watch. The banners were gone. A few lanterns swayed in the breeze, but their flames were dim, like they didn't dare burn too bright. He stepped into the city, and it felt like walking into a dream you couldn't wake from. No voices, no footsteps, just the distant creak of wood and the hush of wind moving through empty stalls. He made his way to the palace. There, at the edge of the long stone stairs, stood a boy, barefoot, pale hair, eyes too wide. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said. Relon knelt beside him. "What?" the boy whispered. "She doesn't hear us anymore." Inside the palace, Light barely touched the stone. Tapestries had been taken down. Paintings turned to face the walls. The air smelled like cold iron and something else, something clean but wrong, like lavender boiled down too far. And then he saw her, Queen Eileen, sitting on her throne in a straight-back chair, hands folded, eyes distant. A crown rested at her feet, untouched, and beside her, standing just behind, a man in gray. Thin, upright, still. Relon didn't speak. Not yet. He waited. One heartbeat. Then two. The queen turned her head slowly. Her voice was flat. "You're not from here." "No," Relon said. "What do you want?" He looked at the man beside her. "I want to remember." The queen blinked once. Her lips pressed into a line. The man in gray didn't move. Not a breath. Not a flinch. Eileen whispered, "There's nothing worth remembering." And there it was. Not anger. Not sorrow. But emptiness. She meant it. Relon stepped forward. Just one pace. "Do you remember the bridge?" he asked. "The one you wrote about. The one with the painted arch. Do you remember what you called it?" She said nothing. "You called it the place where joy crosses without fear." Still silence. Relon turned slowly to the man in gray. He wanted to speak, to ask, to challenge. But the words froze before reaching his mouth. Because the man wasn't looking at him. He was looking past him. And for a moment, Relon felt it. That presence. That impossible weight. Like every part of him was being read, measured, understood, and rewritten. The room was growing colder. Queen Eileen stood. "I don't dream anymore," she said. Relon whispered, "That's not peace." She frowned, just slightly. "I thought it was," she said. Then her eyes flicked to the man in gray. "But now I don't think at all." A low sound began to hum through the stone. Not music, not a voice, just a vibration. Faint, repetitive, steady. Relon took a step back. The walls seemed to lean in. The floor under his boots felt heavier. The torches on the walls dimmed further. And in the quiet, he felt something open. Not a door, a space, a choice. He could leave, turn away, forget what he had seen. Let the silence have its rule. Let the past slip back into shadow. Or he could speak, not loudly, not in defiance. Just speak. But before he could say a word, the man in gray turned his head. And for the first time, Relon saw his eyes. They weren't empty. They were mirrors. And in them, Relon saw himself. Not as he was, but as he would be if he said nothing. Relon stood still, held in place not by force, but by something heavier, recognition. The eyes of the man in gray were polished like glass, reflecting back not just his face, but something deeper. Fear, doubt, the part of him that longed for quiet, the part that wondered if maybe, just maybe, peace was worth forgetting for. The room felt heavier now, not dangerous, just final, as if he'd entered a moment that had waited a long time to happen. Queen Eileen stepped down from the dais, her bare feet brushing against the cold stone. Her gown whispered behind her as she moved. She didn't look at Relon, not directly. She walked past him, stopping beside a long window that had been boarded up. She placed one hand on the wood as though she could still feel the sun on the other side. "I used to write every morning," she said quietly. "Not for the court, not for praise, just to find the shape of what I felt." Relon watched her. She looked younger in that moment, softer, a shadow of the poet she once had been. "I thought he helped," she said. He listened. He made the noise stop. She turned to look at the man in gray. "He told me I didn't need to feel it all." Relon took one slow step closer. "But what did it cost?" Eileen didn't answer right away. Her shoulders rose and fell with a breath that felt like it had waited years to be let out. "Myself," she said, and then the silence broke. Not loudly, not like thunder, but with a single, very small sound. A bell. Faint. Far. A memory. Relon blinked. For a second, the heavy air in the chamber shifted, as if something ancient and still had blinked, confused by the sound. A ripple in the water. The man in gray tilted his head. The bell rang again. Relon's heart moved with it. Not quickly, not wildly, just steadily, as though some part of him had remembered its rhythm. Behind him, more bells began to echo, faint and uncertain. From the town square? From the hills beyond the walls? He didn't know, But the sound was real. Queen Eileen took another step. Her voice, still soft, said, "I never told anyone, but I kept one line." She opened her hand, and it was a tiny piece of parchment, faded, folded so many times it looked like it could vanish with the breeze. She handed it to Relwan. He opened it carefully. It read, "Even if it is quiet, that does not mean it is right." The man in gray didn't move. Not yet, but the light in the room changed. Just slightly. The coldness in the stone seemed to loosen. The shadows on the walls grew softer. And outside, the bells grew louder. Queen Eileen turned to him and whispered, "He will not speak." "He never does. But he doesn't need to." Relwan looked at her, then at the man in gray. "Because people speak for him." She nodded. "They choose him." The tension in the room reached its height, not because of threat, but because of possibility. This was the moment. Not a battle, but of choice. Relwan stepped forward, closer to the figure in gray. "I see you," he said quietly. The man's face did not change. "But I don't need you." And then, with shaking fingers, Relwan folded the parchment back into a square and slid it into the inside of his coat, over his heart. That's when the humming stopped. That strange, low sound that had buzzed in the bones of the room faded like mist in sunlight. The torches flickered. The air shifted again, and the man in gray blinked. Just once. A small, ordinary blink. But it was enough. The light in his eyes dulled. The mirror-like reflection softened into a simple gray. His shape, still standing tall, no longer felt endless. He was just a man. Queen Eileen stepped forward and reached out her hand, not to him, but to the curtain behind her throne. She pulled it down, and for the first time in years, the morning light came through. It wasn't bright, just a warm, quiet light, gentle on the stone, soft against the faces in the room. The man in gray turned his head toward it, as though uncertain of what it meant. And then he walked, not quickly, not in shame, just away, through the tall doors, down the steps, into the morning fog. Relwan didn't follow. He knew now the advisor couldn't be stopped with force, couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be destroyed. But he could be forgotten, and that forgetting could be chosen, just as the silence had once been. Queen Eileen turned to him, her voice almost a breath. "Do you think he'll come back?" Relwan looked at the empty doorway where the figure had stood. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe next time we'll remember sooner." Outside, the bells rang steady now. Clear, not loud, not perfect, but free. For a little while, things felt lighter in Drevenhold. The streets didn't fill with music overnight, and the grayness didn't vanish with the pull of a curtain, but something shifted. People looked up more. A few shopkeepers reopened their stalls. A group of children played beside the empty fountain. They didn't laugh loudly, but they laughed. That alone was something. Queen Eileen resumed writing again. Only a few lines a day. She didn't force it. Her hand was still unsure. But the ink was hers, and the words, though thin and cautious, were beginning to sound like her voice again. Relwan stayed a little longer. Not as a scribe, not as a scholar, just as a witness. He would sit by the window in the palace library and copy nothing. Just observe. The quiet that remained now was different. Not empty, not still in a hollow way. It was a pause, a held breath, a moment between forgetting and remembering. But then something strange happened. On the fourth morning after the advisor had left, Relwan found a book on his bedside table. He hadn't placed it there. The servants hadn't, either. He asked them all. It was a small, cloth-bound volume, with no title on the spine, no author. The pages were thick, slightly uneven, and old enough to smell of dust and damp wood. Inside, there was no table of contents, no clear story, just one phrase at the top of the first page, the record of those who were too late. The pages that followed were filled with names. Hundreds, each written in a different hand. Some clean and sharp, others hurried, misspelled, smudged. A few were just initials. Some pages had sketches, faces half-remembered, places that looked like palaces, chapels, libraries. Others had only one word beneath the name, gone. Relwan turned each page slowly. The air felt different now. He could hear the soft creak of the leather binding, but outside the window, the city was unusually still. Too still. At the center of the book, tucked neatly between pages, was a folded sheet of thicker parchment. On it, written in bold ink, were the words, "He does not work alone." Relon closed the book, sat with it in his lap. Something in his chest tightened. Not fear, but something like realization. Not a return of the Pale Advisor, but something worse. A continuation. The silence hadn't vanished. It had shifted, grown, changed its shape. He rose from the bed and walked quickly down the spiral stair into the lower halls. He found Queen Eileen in the west courtyard, seated on a bench, watching her hands as if trying to remember what they were for. He sat beside her and handed her the book. She didn't ask what it was. She opened it and read. Her fingers hesitated on the page marked with the word gone. "I thought it ended when he left," she said. "I think it just moved," Relon replied. She nodded slowly, then closed the book. That afternoon, messengers arrived from the Western Pass, riders who had come from a neighboring kingdom, Arinthal. Their faces were pale, their horses were too thin, and their news was troubling. King Harland of Arinthal had issued a decree. All archives would be sealed, all festivals postponed indefinitely. Song permits, previously unnecessary, were now required by royal command. It had begun with a suggestion by a new advisor, a woman, dressed in white, with eyes that seemed not to blink. Queen Eileen didn't speak for a long time. Her hands gripped the sides of her chair, knuckles white. "She's not the same one," Relon whispered, "but she's the same silence." He could see it now, a pattern forming, not just of one figure, but of many, carriers of stillness, advisors in different forms. Not always gray, not always male, but always arriving when a ruler was weak, tired, or afraid. They didn't force anything. They just helped. Helped a king avoid mistakes. Helped a queen forget regret. Helped a people let go of their stories. Eileen rose and walked to the far edge of the courtyard, where a vine once climbed the wall but had been cut down years ago. She traced her hand along the stone and said softly, "What if there are dozens of them? Hundreds?" "Then we're not looking for just one answer," Relon replied. "We're looking for a way to remember, even when they try to make us forget." Eileen turned to him. "Then we can't stay here." And with those words, the conflict reached a new point. This was no longer about one ruler, one court, or one shadowed figure. This was about something deeper, woven, like roots under stone. Relon and Eileen gathered what they could. Scrolls, names, letters hidden in the folds of old cloaks, songs half remembered and scrawled on bark. Before sunrise the next day, they left Drevenhold. Not in a parade, not in secret, just quietly with steady steps. They weren't running. They were searching for others who remembered, for towns where the laughter was fading too fast, for halls that used to echo with speech and now echoed with nothing, for children who no longer asked why, and rulers who sat too still for too long. And everywhere they went, they carried the book, the one that named those who were too late. And they added names, not to shame, but to remember. Because if the terrible kings of medieval history had one thing in common, it wasn't cruelty or arrogance or greed. It was forgetting. Forgetting joy. Forgetting music. Forgetting to ask themselves, is this silence truly mine? And as the road stretched on ahead of them, quiet and wide beneath the pale sky, Relon knew they were no longer trying to stop the silence. They were trying to outlast it. The road that stretched before Relon and Queen Eileen was long, but they never rushed. The world beyond Drevenhold had not changed, not completely. There were still birds in the trees, still color in the sky, still people with laughter tucked somewhere deep inside. But there's also something else, something hiding behind closed shutters and beneath quiet dinners. A slow hush spreading not like thunder but like dust. In each village they passed, they listened more than they spoke. They sat in taverns without asking questions. They watched which songs people avoided, which corners children wouldn't play near, which elders seemed to remember more than they said. Sometimes, all it took was a question. "Do you remember the old bell?" Relon would ask gently, and someone would pause. Not always, but sometimes. They'd blink, think too long before answering, and whisper, "It rang every evening, didn't it?" The answer never mattered. It was the pause, that moment of memory returning like the smell of bread from years ago or the sound of a lost friend's voice. Those were the ones who remembered. And those were the ones who needed the book. The record of those who were too late had become something else now. A seed, not a warning. Its pages filled not with endings, but with voices. With poems scratched in the margins. With songs that had once been banned and now found a place to rest. With small drawings, a painted arch, a closed window, a child's open hand. Eileen wrote in it daily. Not grand declarations, not orders or laws. Just moments. Glimpses of what once was. Today, we saw a boy humming to himself. Yesterday, an old man told a story with no fear. Tomorrow, we will knock on a door no one has opened in years. It was in the town of Marshallow where the real turning point came. It was a town not on any recent maps, nestled in a forest that had grown wild with time. It had once been a center of trade, rich with song and painted glass. But now the roads were narrow and twisted, and the houses leaned inward as if bracing for something. They arrived quietly, as they always did. There were no guards, no bells, no children outside, but there was music, faint, distant. A single flute, played not with confidence, but with longing. The kind of tune that doesn't expect anyone to listen, but hopes someone might. Relon followed the sound through winding alleys until they reached the edge of a small courtyard. A boy sat there, knees pulled to his chest, flute at his lips. His eyes were closed. When he saw them, he stopped playing. "I'm not supposed to," he whispered. "Who told you that?" Eileen asked. He pointed toward the tall hall at the end of the street. A building that once might have been a meeting place, now boarded at every window. "They don't like music." "Who's they?" The boy didn't answer. Inside that hall, Relon and Eileen found what they feared and what they expected. Another advisor. This one wore blue. She stood near the center of the room, hands folded calmly in front of her. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, and in the seats around her, townspeople sat still, unmoving, their faces turned toward the front, their eyes unblinking. "They chose peace," the woman said. Her voice was smooth, warm. "They chose to be free of conflict, free of chaos, free of the burden of thought." Eileen took one step forward. "They chose nothing. You offered silence when they needed guidance, stillness when they needed healing. They're not suffering," the advisor said. "Not anymore. But they're not living," Relon answered. The woman in blue looked at him. "Living is complicated." "Exactly." He stepped forward again, holding out the book. They may have been late before, but now they have a choice. He opened it, and somewhere, deep in that quiet chamber, something shifted. A breath, a blink, a child outside, humming again. The book glowed in the low light. Not with magic, not with power, but with presence. With memory. And that was enough. One by one, the people in the chairs began to stir. Not quickly, not like waking from a dream, but slowly, as if realizing that the silence wasn't what they had wanted. It had simply been what was left when everything else was taken. The woman in blue didn't stop them. She didn't vanish. She didn't argue. She only turned and walked away, back into shadow. And just like that, Marshallow began to return to itself. Not all at once, but with a breath. A note, a name remembered. The advisor hadn't failed. She had been let go. That was the real secret. None of these figures could stay where they were no longer believed. Not truly. They needed space to grow. And that space, those cracks, formed only when people gave up remembering what made their voices theirs. Relon and Eileen continued. Town to town, village to village. Each place had its own quiet, its own story. Some kings had sealed away their own joy. Others had let strangers do it for them. But in every place, there were still people holding the thread. A mother who still sang lullabies at night, even if her windows were shuttered. A carpenter who carved birds into every beam, even though he said he didn't know why. A child who asked too many questions and was never told to stop. And now, in the record, those people had names. Their stories were safe. Not grand, not loud, but safe. And in time, the quietest resistance grew louder. Not with shouting, but with remembering. Not with fire, but with story. The most terrible kings in medieval history were remembered not for the damage they caused, but for what they allowed to be lost. Joy, color, connection. They weren't monsters. They were men who stopped listening, who welcomed silence because it asked nothing of them. But now, because of scribes and singers, queens and children, something old was returning. The sound of people choosing to remember, even if it was quiet, even if it took time, even if they had once been late. It had been nearly a year since Relon and Queen Eileen had left Drevenhold. The record had grown thick now, its pages filled not only with names, but with fragments of old lullabies, notes passed between school children, drawings of long-lost city gates, and even recipes once banned for being too joyful. Everywhere they had gone, they had added stories back into the world. Slowly, quietly, like planting seeds before a long spring. They had crossed 12 kingdoms. In each, they'd heard of an advisor, sometimes gray, sometimes white, sometimes draped in violet or gold. Each one slightly different, but each offering the same soft promise: peace without pain, control without conflict, silence in place of sorrow. And now, all the paths had led them here, to the oldest kingdom of them all, Gavermore. It was the seat of what was once the Great Archive, the origin of the royal histories, the place where, long ago, Relon had first learned to copy the truth as others wrote it. Now it was cold and empty. The palace stood untouched by time. Its towers still reached through low clouds. Its stone walls were smooth as glass. But inside, the halls were deserted. No guards, no court, just echo after echo of steps taken too carefully. And at the heart of it, the archive doors still stood. Relon hesitated. Eileen placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to go in." "I do," he whispered. "I started here." He pushed open the doors. They gave way easily, as if expecting him. The scent of parchment and old ink was still in the air. But the shelves, once overflowing, were bare. All the scrolls were gone, except one. In the center of the long marble table, lit by a single high window, sat a scroll bound in black ribbon. Relon stepped toward it. He hesitated, but then he picked it up and unrolled it carefully. It wasn't a decree. It wasn't a warning. It was a letter, handwritten, not printed, not ordered, and it was signed with his own name. He read it once, then again. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but he had never written it. Eileen looked over his shoulder, her voice barely a breath. "What does it say?" He didn't answer at first. Then he read it aloud. "To the one who remembers. There will come a time when silence feels like a favor, when quiet feels like a gift. But you must ask, who profits from peace without memory? Who guides rulers to forget themselves? I try to stop it. I thought I had. But it doesn't end. It waits. If you're reading this, they've found another way. And if they've left this letter behind, they want you to doubt it." Below the words was a symbol neither of them had ever seen before. Not a square, not a circle, a spiral. Relon stepped back. His chest felt heavy, not from fear, but from knowing. "It's not just advisors," he said quietly. Eileen looked at him. "They're not people," he said. "There's something else. Patterns, cycles. They don't just appear in courts. They appear in stories, in rules, in habits. They appear in us," Eileen whispered. And that was the twist neither of them expected. The silence had never just come from outside. It had been allowed in, invited. And once it was inside, it didn't need to be worn like a robe or spoken through a stranger. It lived in the choices people made to stop asking questions, to stop wondering if they still believed in the things they used to sing about. The worst kings in medieval history hadn't always been evil. Some of them had simply been tired, some confused, some convinced they were helping. They didn't fall into tyranny with shouts and swords. They fell quietly, one compromise at a time, one silence after another, until there was nothing left of them but cold stone and forgotten names. Eileen stepped to the center of the room and reached for the candle sitting by the scroll. She lit it, not to burn the letter, but to read it again, slowly, clearly, in full light. Then she said, "We still choose." Relon nodded. Even if the spiral returned, even if silence came wearing a new face, even if forgetting was easier, they could still choose. Not perfectly, but clearly. And that was enough. They left the archive as the morning light broke through the high windows. Together, the scroll left open, not hidden. The record in Rellen's satchel heavier than ever. full not only with the stories of others, but with the memory of how close they had all come to losing themselves. And outside, for the first time in decades, the bells of Gavermore began to ring. Soft, steady, not to signal a victory, but to remind the people that it was morning, and that the world, though still uncertain, still changing, still quietly dangerous, had not yet been forgotten. The bells of Gavermore rang through the empty streets like voices long buried, rising to speak again. They weren't loud. They didn't echo with celebration or power. They were simple, tired, steady, but they rang after years of silence. And that alone made them remarkable. As Relon and Queen Eileen stepped out into the early sun, the light fell in golden streaks between high towers, catching on old stone carvings, faded banners, and the worn steps that had seen generations pass. The city had not been destroyed. It had only been asleep, and now gently it was waking up. They didn't look back at the palace. There was no need to. The real work wasn't behind them. It was in the hands of others now. In every village they'd visited, every child who dared to hum, every baker who scribbled a secret recipe in the corner of parchment, every name remembered in the record. As they made their way through the outer gardens, Eileen spoke softly. I used to think being a good ruler meant being strong, untouchable, that if people feared nothing under your command, you had done your duty. She touched a branch of a wild lavender bush that had somehow survived the years untamed. But it wasn't strength I needed, she said. It was softness, curiosity, space for others. Relon nodded. Most of the worst kings never realized that either. They feared being questioned more than they feared being forgotten. So they listened only to the ones who told them what they wanted to hear. And slowly, they became echoes of themselves. They walked until the path narrowed, turning into dirt and soft moss underfoot. The great walls of Gavermore faded behind them, becoming smaller with each step, like the closing of an old book whose pages had been read and understood at last. At a bend in the road, they stopped. Below them lay a hill, and beyond it, a valley. Small homes dotted the green, their chimneys just beginning to smoke. A child was feeding chickens at the edge of garden. Someone strummed a soft tune on a lute. A voice hummed a wordless melody. It was a place untouched by palaces, advisors, or decrees. And yet, it felt truer than any royal hall. They sat together on a stone outcrop, not speaking for a while. Then Eileen asked, "Do you think it's over?" Relon smiled faintly. "No, but I don't think it has to be over. I think it just has to be noticed." She looked at him. As long as someone remembers, the silence can't take everything. He reached into his satchel and drew out the record. The pages were worn now, corners curled, some of the ink faded, but it was beautiful in its own way, lived in, honest. He opened to a blank page near the back. "What should we write?" he asked. Eileen was quiet, her eyes still on the distant valley. Then she said, "Write this, the silence grows when no one sings. But it fades when even one person remembers the tune." Relon wrote the words slowly, carefully. Then he closed the book and held it in his lap. He thought of the faces he'd seen across the journey. The mother who whispered bedtime stories behind drawn curtains. The boy who played his flute even when he was told not to. The innkeeper who kept a banned poem folded in her apron. The old woman who cried when she heard the sound of a bell for the first time in 20 years. They weren't kings or queens. They were the keepers of memory, and they were the ones who mattered most. Eileen stood first. "We should go." Relon followed her up the hill, back into the sunlight. The path ahead was uncertain, but that was all right. They no longer needed to know where every step would lead. They just needed to keep walking, keep listening, and keep reminding others that their voices mattered. As they passed through a small wooden gate, an old man looked up from his stool, squinting in the morning light. "You travelers?" he asked. "Just passing through," Eileen replied. The man pointed toward a bench near his porch. "Rest a while. You look like you've come a long way." They smiled and accepted. The old man poured them tea from a battered pot and said nothing more. But as he sat beside them, he pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, thin and fragile, ink smudged from years of wear. Relon leaned closer and saw the edges of a song, one he hadn't heard in years. The old man looked up. My mother used to sing this, he said. I don't remember the whole thing. Eileen smiled. Sing what you can. And so he did. The words were shaky, the tune uncertain, but it was beautiful in its own way, like the flicker of a candle in a forgotten room, bringing warmth to corners long left cold. As the old man sang, others came closer. A girl sounded the steps. A merchant leaned on his cart. A dog curled up in the sun nearby. No one spoke. They just listened. And when the song ended, no one clapped. They just sat there in stillness. Not the heavy, cold stillness of forgotten courts, but a peaceful kind, the kind that came when people remembered who they were. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned soft with stars, Relon and Eileen walked to the edge of the village. They paused beneath a tree where paper lanterns hung like memories drifting in the wind. Eileen turned to him and said, "Thank you for not giving up, for reminding me." Relon shook his head. "You reminded yourself. I just walked with you." And then, without ceremony, they kept walking. There'd be other towns, other rulers, other silences trying to settle in. But now, there are also readers, singers, writers, mothers, children, and one book tucked safely in a worn leather bag, carrying every remembered name, every whispered truth, every quiet act of resistance that kept the silence from staying too long. The terrible kings of medieval history would always be remembered, but so would those who made sure they didn't return. Not with swords, but with memory, and a song that was never quite forgotten, even in the quiet, even in the dark, even in sleep. The next morning came quietly. The sky was a soft gray, not heavy, not bright, just calm. Relon and Eileen walked through the village without speaking much, each step light, as if the silence had finally changed. Not the silence that devours, but the kind that lets the world breathe. In a small square, someone had begun humming. The tune was familiar, something Relon couldn't place exactly, but it carried warmth, like a blanket remembered from childhood. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for anyone. It was just there. The record was heavier now, not because of the pages or ink, but because of what it meant. It was no longer a warning. It was a living memory. Each story inside had made space for someone else to keep their own voice. The kings who had once ruled with fear or silence were no longer the only ones remembered. In fact, their stories had become doorways, ways to understand what happens when power forgets to listen. Queen Eileen had changed too. She no longer carried herself with the stiff posture of royalty. She didn't look for approval in every glance. She moved gently, like someone who'd finally learned her own rhythm after years of walking to someone else's pace. Her rule had ended the moment she stepped off the throne, but her influence had only just begun. People didn't follow her for her title anymore. They followed her because she remembered how to feel. As they left the village, a few townspeople walked with them for a while. One of them, a boy no older than 12, handed Eileen a small folded note. She opened it and smiled. Inside was a drawing of a bell, surrounded by stars, and one sentence beneath it. "If I forget, ring this for me." They continued on. The road curved gently through meadows that hadn't been walked in years. Every step forward felt easier than the last. Relon still carried the old scroll from Gavranmore, the one with his name, written in his own hand. It still didn't make sense. Not fully. He hadn't written it, and yet it felt like something inside him had. Maybe it was from another time, or maybe it was a reminder of how close he'd come to becoming someone who forgot his own voice. That was the twist he couldn't stop thinking about. The pale advisors, the women in white, the ones who stood near every terrible king. They didn't force anyone into silence. They just waited for it to be welcomed. They grew stronger when people wanted easy answers, when rulers feared mistakes, when voices felt like risks. But they weakened the moment someone questioned them, the moment someone chose to speak or sing or simply remember. In the end, the real power wasn't in crowns or swords or royal decrees. It was in stories, in memories, in shared laughter and honest tears. The terrible kings of medieval history had ruled with fear, yes, but they had also ruled with emptiness. They took away music and replaced it with order. They erased names and replaced them with titles. They silenced their own people and called it peace. But none of them lasted. Every kingdom eventually remembered, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but they remembered, and that's what mattered. As they reached a hillside overlooking 3 winding rivers, Elaine stopped. Below them, a large oak tree stood alone. Its branches stretched wide, old and twisted, full of moss and quiet strength. Relon looked at her, and without a word, they walked down together. Beneath the tree, she sat and placed the record on her lap. It was time. They opened the last page. There was no plan for what they'd write. No speech prepared. Just the sense that this part of the journey had come to its end. Elaine held the pen, hesitating. Then she wrote, "The worst kings taught us what not to become. But the people, the ordinary remembering people, taught us how to begin again." She passed the book to Relon. He wrote beside it, "May this silence remain the kind we choose, not the kind that is chosen for us." They closed the record together. For a long time, they sat in silence. Not the eerie kind, not the cold or forced kind, just peace, just stillness. A warm wind moved through the grass. In the distance, someone laughed. It was enough. Later, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned golden, they rose and walked back toward the road. They didn't need to look behind them. The tree, the field, the record, they would remain just as the stories inside would. Not in stone or banners, but in people. In every corner of every kingdom where someone remembered what it meant to feel. The terrible kings would still be written about in books. Their laws might still be studied, their mistakes discussed. But now, so would the moments when people stood up again, when voices returned, when bells rang again after years of stillness. And most importantly, when someone whispered to another, "Do you remember?" Because in that moment, memory won, and with it the silence lost. As stars began to appear and the road faded into the soft blue of dusk, Relon smiled. He didn't know where they would go next, but that was all right. The world was big. There were more stories to hear, more names to protect, and as long as they kept listening, the silence would never win again. Not fully, not forever, not while even one voice remained. To remember, to sing, to write, to be. And so, the terrible kings faded into memory. But the ones who remembered, they lived on, quietly, beautifully, endlessly.